The man they told to leave. "Get your hands off the gate, sir. You're not on the list." The young military guard didn't hesitate. One shove, and the old man hit the pavement outside Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery with a dull, sickening thud. His knees scraped hard against the stone, one hand still clutching a crushed white lily, the other bracing himself against the cold metal of the gate. A ripple of silence washed through the surrounding guests. But no one moved, no one helped, no one even asked his name. He wasn't wearing medals. His coat was old, the fabric sun-faded sleeves fraying at the cuffs. His marine boots were polished but cracked from time and dust. On his lapel sat a single unit patch, 3rd Recon Laos 17th, a name that meant nothing to the polished men in ceremony blues and clipboards. From behind mirrored sunglasses, a senior protocol officer from the Pentagon stepped forward. His voice was smooth, sterile. "Mr. Colton, is it?" he said, glancing at a list on his clipboard. "You're not on the guest manifest. This is a restricted ceremony for high command personnel. You'll have to step away from the gate." Raymond Colton didn't argue. He said nothing at all. He simply rose slowly, brushing dust from his palms. His left knee trembled slightly. He'd once been hit with shrapnel near Khe Sanh, and the scar still locked up in the cold. Still gripping the flower, he gave a faint nod and stepped back, standing just outside the gate like a statue someone had forgotten to move. The guests returned to their conversations. Phones buzzed, laughter floated on the breeze. A military band began warming up near the grandstand, practicing slow ceremonial notes for the burial of General Russell Thorne, one of the most decorated generals in U.S. Army history. Inside the walls, the white chairs were lined in perfect formation. Press cameras adjusted their lenses. Flags hung at half-staff. And outside those walls, a Marine veteran stood alone, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes pale blue and fixed on the platform. He had come 6 hours by bus, left Barstow before dawn, walked nearly a mile from the last stop. He hadn't told anyone he was coming, hadn't RSVP'd. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for permission to say goodbye. But the world no longer had a place for men like Raymond Colton. "Just another relic," someone murmured behind the gate. "A staffer, maybe a lieutenant. He's not even in uniform regulation." A younger officer near the front chuckled. He looks like he wandered in from the VA clinic. "You watching this? Tell us in the comments, should he have been turned away? Or does a man's silence sometimes speak louder than clearance?" He didn't hear the words, or maybe he did but chose not to answer them. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowing envelope. A single name written in ink now faded from decades of folded corners to Colton. "Only if he shows up." He didn't open it. He'd already read it once. That had been enough. In 1971, deep in the jungle outside Luang Prabang, a recon team had been ambushed during an unauthorized extraction. 3 officers trapped behind enemy lines, one analyst, a young woman named Amelia Hart, wounded. Radio down. Smoke and blood choking the forest air. They weren't supposed to be there. The mission didn't exist. The unit didn't exist. But Raymond had gone in anyway. He never stayed for the photos, declined the citation, disappeared after his 3rd tour. Some said he had died in Cambodia, some said he never existed at all, but there he stood now, in the flesh, at the gate of a nation's grief. The flower in his hand had begun to droop, and then something shifted. From the far side of the platform, beyond the rows of white chairs and dress uniforms, a figure paused, her posture rigid, sword at her hip, braid of steel-grey hair tucked beneath a service cap, her eyes locked across the field, across the podium, across the heads of generals and reporters. She saw him. 4-star General Amelia Hart narrowed her gaze. The scar across her left hand, The one Raymond had wrapped with torn canvas in the back of a medevac chopper twitched slightly. She turned to one of her aides. "Who let him in?" The aide whispered. "No one," she said. The aide blinked. "Should we have him removed?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped down from the platform. At the gate, Raymond shifted his weight. The guards stiffened, cameras began to move, murmurs filled the air. And then she walked, one step at a time, through the silent rows of chairs, through the noise and confusion and rank, until she stood at the gate and met his eyes. He didn't salute, he didn't bow, he just nodded once, faintly, and she raised her right hand. A salute, sharp, clean, public. For the first time in 50 years, someone remembered. Across the aisle, Protocol Officer Charles Brennan froze his hand midair with a clipboard. His lips tightened, his head shook in disbelief. But it was too late. The ceremony had changed, and the man they tried to erase had just been saluted by the highest-ranking woman in the history of the United States Army. Before anyone else moved, General Hart turned to the nearest microphone and spoke 4 words that shattered the silence. "Tell them who you are. And now we ask you, what would you have done if you saw that old man pushed down? Should clearance matter more than sacrifice? Comment, salute if you believe Raymond should have been let in. And stay with us, because what happens next will make you believe in justice again." Those who weren't on the list. "Heroes with no medals don't get a seat here." That line wasn't whispered, it was said with a smirk. And it came not from a young recruit, but from Charles Brennan, the White House military liaison himself, speaking directly into his earpiece as General Amelia Hart walked away from the podium. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking about her, and about the man she had just saluted. The comment didn't go unnoticed. A nearby staffer flinched. Another officer, older, paused with furrowed brows. But nobody said a word. And yet out at the gate, Raymond Colton still stood quietly, the white lily drooping in his hand like a flag that had lost the wind. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't chase recognition. But every second that passed, more people began to notice. Eyes shifted. A murmur of unease swept across the ranks. Something about the way the general had looked at him. Something about her words, "Tell them who you are." But how do you tell a room of generals, press, and dignitaries who you are when no one asked, "Who do you speak to?" When the war you fought never officially existed. While Brennan scrambled behind the scenes to regain control of the optics, something else began to happen. A young woman in a black dress with a camera slung across her shoulder paused just outside the press zone. Claire Marlowe, 29, local reporter for a Veterans Initiative blog, had been assigned to cover the burial of General Thorne. She hadn't expected anything more than ceremonial angles and a few respectful quotes. But now her lens pointed directly at the man beyond the gate. She zoomed in. Click. His coat was Marine Corps issue, circa 1969. The insignia on his shoulder wasn't standard. She adjusted focus. Her brow furrowed. 3rd Recon Laos, 71. Her grandfather had served recon in Vietnam. She'd seen that exact patch only once before in an old footlocker her family kept in the attic, stamped top secret. No unit name, no photos, just a folded map and a blood-stained field notebook. Claire lowered the camera. Her breath caught. "Excuse me," she said to a passing army major. "Who is that man at the gate?" The major barely looked. "No one. He's not on the list." She didn't move. She kept recording. Viewers, what would you do if you found out someone who saved lives had been erased from the official records? Drop a comment below with the word honor if you believe those who served should never be forgotten. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel, because the next few minutes will change everything you thought you knew about service, sacrifice, and silence. Back inside the press area, Claire uploaded the first clip. No caption, no narration, just 30 seconds of raw footage, an old man standing alone and a four-star general saluting him. Within 4 minutes, it had over 18,000 views. The whispers turned to questions. Who is he? Why did she salute him? Why wasn't he let in? Then came the live comments. Is that Colton? My dad served with a Colton in Nam. I know that patch. That unit was ghosted. Why isn't this on the news? Back at the gate, Raymond had sat down on the low stone wall. His left hand trembled slightly from fatigue, but he didn't ask for help. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a second envelope. The edges were cracked. On the back in fading black ink, just one line, for when the world forgets. He didn't open it yet. But someone else did approach. A woman in her 40s, wearing the deep blue of a Navy lieutenant commander, stepped away from the crowd. Her heels clicked against the stone as she walked, deliberate and uncertain. She knelt next to him. Sir, she said softly. My name is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Levin. My father used to talk about a Raymond Colton. He said you pulled him out of a crater under fire in Laos. Is that you? Raymond looked at her. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her eyes filled with tears. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph, faded, folded, almost broken in half. 2 Marines. A third crouched beside them, blurry in motion. Blood on a bandage, jungle in the background. Raymond's voice cracked for the first time. Johnson, he whispered. And that's McVeigh. He didn't make it out. She nodded. My dad did. Thanks to you. Another officer noticed the exchange and stepped closer. Then a second. And soon a small circle had formed around the man no one had let in, not out of curiosity, but out of quiet reverence. Brennan spotted the shift from across the lawn. His jaw tensed. We need to shut that down, he muttered into his mic. He's not part of the official ceremony. But it was too late. The crowd had already begun to turn. A Marine captain crossed the line first, then an Air Force colonel. They didn't speak. They didn't salute. They just stood near Raymond, forming an unofficial perimeter, not for protection but for presence. And still, the list said nothing about him. That was the part Brennan couldn't control. The paper in his hands didn't include heroism. It didn't account for the men who didn't return with medals. It didn't have a column for valor in silence. But the people they remembered. Claire's live stream now had 200,000 views and rising. The comment section was flooded. Let him in. This man carried 3 soldiers on his back and they won't let him sit. America needs to do better by its veterans. Even the Secretary of the Army turned his head from the front row. Raymond opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single line handwritten in blocky capital letters. If you read this and you're still standing, it means I never got to thank you. It was signed simply Thorn. The very man being buried. A gust of wind swept across the cemetery, catching the edge of the paper in Raymond's hand. He gripped it tightly. Around him, the circle of silence deepened. Then from the stage, a voice echoed across the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, a brief delay in the ceremony. Please remain seated. But the crowd didn't sit. They stood, one by one, some with hats over hearts, others with hands at their sides, all of them now watching one man, and Raymond, still holding the flowers, still wearing the old coat, stood with them. He hadn't moved, the country around him had, and just before the screen faded to black, Claire whispered into her live stream mic, they said he wasn't on the list. But it looks like the list was wrong. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will make every forgotten name matter again. Do you believe some honors go unspoken too long? Type respect in the comments if you're still with us. And Hit subscribe because in part 3, someone steps forward who should have never forgotten, and the whole world will watch. Cliffhanger. A hand reaches for the microphone on stage, but it's not who anyone expected. Would you have stood up for him or walked past? We'll find out together. The one who remembered is that Sergeant Colton. The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from the stage, into a hot microphone, into the hush of a nation's funeral, and it came from General Amelia Hart, the most decorated living female officer in the United States Army, whose hand now trembled ever so slightly as she stepped away from the podium. She wasn't supposed to speak yet. The defense secretary hadn't finished. But none of that mattered anymore. All eyes turned. Charles Brennan's clipboard dropped to his side. His lips parted, but no words came. He had worked 18 months preparing the ceremony for General Russell Thorne, a former Joint Chiefs legend architect of half a dozen global operations, and now a name etched in stone. It was meant to be flawless, controlled, prestigious, but what he hadn't planned for was the return of a ghost. And ghosts once remembered don't go back into silence. Sergeant Colton, General Hart said again, louder this time, as she began walking slowly down the aisle between the white chairs and brass-trimmed generals. "You're not supposed to be here, but I'm so damn glad you are." Raymond didn't respond. He stood motionless by the stone wall, hands still wrapped around the crumpled flower. A shadow of disbelief flickered across his face. It had been over 50 years since he'd heard anyone call him by rank. Over 50 years since someone in uniform looked at him with anything but indifference or confusion. People began murmuring. Some reached for their phones. Some lowered them out of instinct. And then she said it, the line that split the ceremony in two. "This man saved my life in Laos. 1971. I would not be standing here today without him. Neither would General Thorne." It was like someone had dropped a match into dry leaves. Across the aisle, a retired colonel gasped. One of the Marines in the honor guard blinked rapidly and shifted his stance. Claire Marlowe, the young reporter, had tears in her eyes before she even realized it. The live stream doubled in views in 20 seconds. Comments flooded in. "What? He saved the general? That's the guy from the classified extraction. She remembers him after all these years." Type, "Never forget," if this is the moment that broke you. But it wasn't just words. It was what she did next. General Hart reached the gate. Without a word, she removed her gloves, tucked them into her belt, and stood directly in front of the man everyone had dismissed. And in front of the most powerful military figures in America, she raised her hand and saluted. It was slow, precise, personal. The kind of salute given not to a superior, not to an equal, but to a savior. Raymond's lips parted, but no sound came. He didn't return the salute. He simply looked into her eyes and whispered, "I thought I'd been erased." She nodded. "You were. By them. But not by me." Behind them, the murmur turned into an emotional stillness. You could hear nothing but the ocean wind and the clicking of distant camera shutters, though even those began to still. And then, from behind the gate, General Hart turned to face the stage once more. Brennan tried to step forward, but she raised her hand. "No, you've said enough." He froze. For once, the voice of control was silenced. She turned to the audience. "You want to talk about service. You want to talk about heroism. This man carried me bleeding through 2 miles of jungle under fire. He carried General Thorne on his back while we laid covering rounds. He never got a medal. He refused a photo. And then he disappeared because he wasn't interested in being remembered." She paused. "But I remembered." The crowd was silent. And then came the fallout. A rear admiral in the second row stood up. No words, just stood. Then a 3-star general. Then a Navy chaplain. Then the entire front row. One by one, those in uniform rose not out of obligation, but out of recognition. A slow wave of standing reverence swept through the rows of white chairs and marble uniforms. No command, no protocol, just silent honor. Brennan stepped back, eyes burning with disbelief. He grabbed his earpiece, pulled the cameras, get control of the feed, but the feed was already lost. Claire Marlowe's live stream hit 500,000. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "This is history, and this is justice." Now, if you're still with us, drop a comment with "Stand with Colton" if you believe this was the moment everything changed. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is why we tell these stories, because justice for veterans doesn't come from paperwork. It comes from people who remember. Amelia Hart turned back to Raymond. Her voice dropped no longer for the crowd, but just for him. "I still remember what you said right after the medevac lifted off." Raymond blinked, eyes wet now. She whispered, "You said get home. Don't waste it." He nodded barely. "I didn't," she said. And then, in a move that no one saw coming, she took the microphone off the stand and walked it to him, held it out, waited. He didn't take it at first. But when he did, his hand closed over hers, not to grab, but to thank. Raymond stepped forward just enough that the microphone picked up his words. "I came here to return a promise," he said, voice low but clear. "Not to speak, not to be seen, just to say goodbye to the man who made it back because I didn't leave him behind." He looked around, scanning the rows of officers, soldiers, civilians, press. "And I thought I'd do it alone." He looked at Amelia again. "Thank you for not forgetting." He didn't speak another word. He simply handed back the mic, turned toward the platform, and stood still. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. A staff sergeant in the honor guard stepped out of formation. He reached into a side pouch and removed something. A box, simple, wooden, polished. He carried it down the aisle and placed it in Raymond's hands. General Hart stepped beside him again. "Sergeant Colton," she said, "General Thorne left this with me. He wanted you to carry him the rest of the way." Raymond's fingers trembled as he touched the urn. His lips pressed together, and for the first time in a long time, his eyes shut. The nation watched in silence. No one dared speak, not even Brennan. He had already been defeated, not with politics or orders, but with memory. And the memory of one man just rewrote the ending of a general's legacy. Before this moment fades, we ask you, do you believe in remembering the forgotten? Type "I remember" in the comments. Because part 4 is coming, and in it, the man who was erased will be asked to do something no one saw coming. Known by name, without a medal, he is the reason we're all standing here. General Amelia Hart's voice cracked as she spoke the words into the silence, and for a moment time held its breath. Raymond Colton stood at the center of a sea of decorated officers, holding the polished wooden urn of the very man this entire funeral had been planned to honor, General Russell Thorne. And yet somehow every eye in the cemetery was no longer on the general. They were on the man who never made it onto the list. No one told him where to go. No usher guided his steps. But Raymond, with the same quiet strength that once carried wounded soldiers through fire, began to walk forward, one slow, steady step at a time, the urn held close to his chest, as if it were more than ashes, as if it were memory made solid. The honor guard stood frozen. A Marine flinched slightly, unsure whether to move aside or call for clearance. But the glance from General Hart was enough. They parted, silently, respectfully, as if they knew instinctively this was the real ceremony. Viewers watching the stream exploded in emotion. Let him walk. That man is the hero today. Type "walk him home" if your heart is in your throat. Claire Marlowe wiped her eyes behind the camera. This wasn't the story she came to cover. It had become something deeper, something that reminded people of a truth long buried under press releases and paperwork, that not every hero is handed a ribbon. Some carry the weight of silence instead. Raymond reached the platform. He didn't ascend the steps. He paused and looked to Amelia. She stepped up beside him and extended her hand again, not to take the urn, but to offer support. He climbed the steps slowly, the crowd still standing. When he reached the podium, he turned not to the mic, but to the gathered faces below. And for the first time that day, his voice filled the space like a whisper carried by wind. "I never expected to be asked to do this," he said, eyes scanning the front row. "And I don't stand here because I'm better than any man I served with. I stand here because I came back." He placed the urn gently on the platform next to the folded flag. "I carried General Thorn out of Laos. He carried me through everything that followed." The weight of those words sank like anchors into every heart in the field. Charles Brennan, still seated behind the press barrier, began typing furiously on his phone. Messages to the Department of Defense Crisis Control Team's PR units. But no one cared anymore. The feed was owned by the people now, and it was broadcasting truth. Raymond turned back to the mic. "I declined medals because I didn't think I earned them. Men better than me died in that jungle. I wasn't supposed to be remembered." He looked toward the horizon where the sea met the cliffs. But today, someone did. The silence that followed was complete. No planes overhead, no whispers, just presence. Then came the sound of chairs scraping quietly on stone. A line of elderly men, some with canes, others in wheelchairs, began making their way from the rear of the crowd. They were the last living members of 3rd Recon, Ghost Company. Faces weathered by time, eyes rimmed with tears, and every single one of them wore a patch that matched the one on Raymond's coat. They formed a line beside the stage, and then, one by one, they saluted him. Each salute hit harder than the last. Each hand raised was a declaration to the world. We remember. We bear witness. We still stand. Raymond lowered his head. He could not return the salutes. His hands were too full. But the tremble in his jaw said everything. One of the men, a tall black veteran with a silver cane, stepped forward and handed Raymond something wrapped in cloth. A piece of the original map from Laos. Blood-stained, faded. "We thought you were gone," he said. "We've been carrying this, waiting." The tears came then, not just in Raymond's eyes, but in the crowd. The chaplain standing near the flag wiped his cheeks. A young cadet in uniform removed his hat in stunned silence. Even Amelia Hart had to look away for a moment, composing herself with a breath that quivered. And then Raymond said one line that broke whatever walls still remained in that cemetery. "I didn't come back to be honored. I came back because I promised I would carry him home." It was the line everyone needed. Because this wasn't just about Thorn. This was about the forgotten, the erased, the ones left off the guest lists of history. General Hart stepped forward, then let him rest now, and let the world remember who carried him here. Raymond bowed his head and turned toward the casket. He laid the urn down with both hands. A single bugle began to play. Taps. Slow. Clear. Devastating. Not for the general. For the man who walked the last steps alone. As the last note faded into the wind, the crowd erupted not in applause, but in a collective gesture of reverence. Hundreds raised hands to foreheads. Veterans lifted canes into the air. Others simply placed hands over hearts. Behind the platform, a boy, maybe 10 years old, whispered to his grandfather, "Was he famous?" "No," the old man replied. "He was more than that." Back by the press line, Charles Brennan stood still. He knew he had lost. But what stung more than that was the realization that no one would remember his name. Comment I stand for Colton. If this part broke you, subscribe now because in part 5 we witness what happens after the dust settles when the world decides whether to walk away or finally honor those who walked alone. And before we fade out, a final image burned into memory, Raymond Colton descending the steps, not to applause, not to cameras, but into the arms of the men who had waited half a century to say, "Welcome back." The living symbol. We don't salute medals, we salute memory. The words came not from the stage but from the voice of a retired Navy chaplain as Raymond Colton stepped down from the platform. His hands were empty now. The urn rested beside the folded flag. The promise was fulfilled, the weight was laid down. But something else had been picked up in its place on her. After 51 years of silence, the man who had once vanished into the forgotten corners of America's wars now walked among those who stood in solemn awe, not because of rank, but because they saw in him what so many had lost: integrity, without noise, courage, without condition. As Raymond reached the grass once more, the old veterans of Ghost Company gathered around him. They didn't cheer, they didn't speak much. A hand on the shoulder here, a slow nod there. Quiet communion between men who had once crawled through jungles together, who had buried too many without ceremony. Claire, Marlowe, still filming from a respectful distance, whispered to her audience, "You're watching something we don't see anymore. You're watching a nation, remember?" But not everyone stood proudly. Off to the side behind the tent, Charles Brennan leaned against the black SUV meant for high-level transport. His arms were crossed jaw tight, his carefully coordinated funeral had unraveled. His press statements, his bullet points, his version of legacy had been eclipsed by one man's walk across a cemetery lawn. Someone approached. It was Secretary Langley Thorne's longtime friend and current head of the Department of Veterans Affairs. He stopped beside Brennan, arms folded. "You knew," Langley said. Brennan said nothing. "You knew who he was, you knew he was alive, and you tried to keep him off the record." Still no reply. Langley leaned closer. "You tried to erase him." Now Brennan finally responded, his voice low, deflective. He didn't fit the narrative. Langley stared at him long and hard. Then he turned and walked away. Later that evening, Brennan's name would be quietly removed from several committees. His official statement would never be released. His version of history would be lost, replaced by one that had the courage to remember. If you're still watching, type "I remember" in the comments, because this is what remembering truly looks like. 3 weeks passed, and then without warning, the footage from Fort Rosecrans was played live on C-SPAN during a Veterans Affairs panel. Then it aired again on the evening news. Then again on late-night features. Soon letters began to pour in, from veterans, from children of the fallen, from Americans who had never served but now finally understood what had been lost when silence replaced gratitude. And then came the moment no one expected. On a bright spring morning at the foot of a Pacific bluff just south of San Diego, a crowd of over 200 gathered beneath a stone archway newly unveiled. The bronze letters above the entrance gleamed in the sunlight, the Raymond Colton Center for Silent Heroes. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, but inside it held rooms for counseling, a memorial garden, a library of unclassified field journals from units that had never been honored properly, and a wall etched not with medals but with names no one had seen in years. Many of those names had never been spoken aloud at any official ceremony until now. Raymond didn't want to speak at the opening, but he came. He stood to the side as always, wearing the same faded coat, the same boots that had walked across rice paddies and parking lots alike. In his hand he held a single white lily. Its petals had browned at the edges, but he carried it with the same reverence as he had the urn. General Hart was there too, in civilian attire now, her service cap folded under one arm. She didn't speak either at first. But after the ribbon was cut and the final handshakes exchanged, she walked to Raymond and handed him a small box. Inside was something almost too simple, a compass, the same one she had dropped in the mud 50 years ago. He had picked it up back then, tucked it into her vest, and never mentioned it again. "I kept it," she said softly, "because you were the one who got us home." He looked down at it, eyes glistening, and replied with the quiet weight of a man who had no use for grand words. "Then keep it still. Just keep it pointing north." Behind them, a child tugged on Raymond's coat. A boy no more than 8 with a camo jacket, a size too big, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Thank you, Sergeant Colton." "Were you really a hero?" the boy asked. Raymond knelt slowly, knees crackling like old wood. He looked the boy in the eyes. "I was just a Marine," he said, "but I served with heroes." Then he handed the boy the lily, and the boy held it like it was gold. This is where the story could end. But if you've made it this far, you know it doesn't, because remembering isn't an ending. It's a beginning. A few feet away, Claire Marlowe stood beside her camera. She hadn't posted in days, not because she didn't have content, but because she wanted this moment to live quietly for a while, untouched by algorithms. She turned off the lens, just watched. So now we turn to you, the ones who stayed through every step, every silence, every salute. Let us ask you, how many heroes have we walked past without knowing? How many names were never spoken because they didn't fit the list? And if you had one moment, just one, to honor someone who never asked for recognition, would you take it? Drop a comment with the words, "I would stand," if this story moved you. Share this video if you believe we must never again let quiet valor go unnoticed. And subscribe, because here at Grateful Stories we don't forget. Not ever. Because in the end, true legacy isn't carved in stone, it's carried in the hearts of those who remember.